Good morning and welcome to the worship service here at Sardis Missionary Baptist Church. I am Reverend Ramone R. Billingsley, standing in for Reverend Dr. Kurt Sean Clark Sr., who is the senior pastor here at this great church. Today is a special day. It is Pastor Clark's 14th pastoral anniversary. Yes, we are celebrating 14 years this year of marriage between pastor and congregation. God sends pastors to churches to do the work of ministry, and we're excited today as we celebrate this month Pastor Clark's 14th year pastoring this great church. I want to invite your attention this morning to Exodus chapter 3. And I want to begin reading at verse 1. And I think this is a timely message as we celebrate 14 years of pastoral ministry, 14 years of doing the work of ministry here in the Bush Hills community, here in Birmingham Baptist Church. I invite you to Exodus chapter 3. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version. And it reads as follows. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. Moses looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppressed them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. The word of the Lord for the people of God. The word is already blessed. I want to talk about, for a few minutes this morning, a man sent to lead. A man sent to lead. One day, a young man went swimming out into deep water. His father and others were standing around the banks of this body of water. as this young man was enjoying a nice hot summer day, swimming and enjoying the rhythm of the waves. When his family looked up, this young man was about to drown. Something had happened just that quickly. And while trying to swim, they saw this young man, going down. What was supposed to be a day of family fun and fellowship was quickly turning into a day of unexpected tragedy. Naturally, the young man's family, and especially his father, got nervous and afraid, but the father, in his nervousness, could not swim. And he stood there nervously and helplessly with tears in his eyes. So the father looked round about him, and just so happened there was a rope nearby. The father took that rope and threw it into the body of water and told his son to catch the rope. The young man caught the rope, and the father started pulling the young man in. But he looked up and saw that the rope was breaking. The young man cried out to his father. He said, "Father, Father, my rope is breaking." So the father screamed out to the son and said, "Reach beyond the break and hold on." So the young man reached beyond the break and held on as tight as he could. And the father pulled and pulled and pulled his son until he got his son back onto the bank. What a wonderful illustration this is, a wonderful story of the pastor at work. For you see, the pastor helps to rescue people who are drowning in life's helpless situation. Yes, the pastor helps women and men take their hands out of the shackles of the messiness of life in order to restore them to an abundant life. The pastor helps people to stay on the potter's wheel, if you will, so that the potter, God, can do God's great work over and over again, shaping church, shaping people, shaping individuals into God's image. The pastor risks everything. Pastor risks time, family, personal relationships outside of church, personal health, even vacation time, just to get the pastoral job done. But only one who is sent by God is equipped to do the work. Yes, not everybody can do this kind of work. It's not all fun and games. This is serious work, and it is the kind of ministry work that is not to be trivialized or taken for granted. So we are blessed today as we pay tribute and honor to the one who fits this magnificent profile of one who is at work, helping people to navigate the messiness of life. Now, I want to submit to you today that God calls the pastor to lead people through their suffering so that they can experience the presence and power of God unhindered. Yes, the pastor is a gesture. The pastor is a gift of God's grace and a response to God's concern for God's people. The compassion of God is expressed through the life and work of the pastor, the leader, and throughout the story of Israel's 400 years of oppression, we constantly see that it is God who is concerned about Israel's life. It is God who is concerned about their state of affairs. So as a response to their physical and spiritual oppression, God calls Moses to step up to the plate as an emancipator and proclaimer of true truth in order to rescue God's people out of their situation. But Israel's situation did not catch God by surprise. It caught Moses by surprise, as you can see from what we read in our text. But it did not catch God off by surprise. Because if you go all the way back to Genesis chapter 15, God had told Abram that Israel would be slaves for 400 years. That was a fact. But he also told Abram that he would deliver Israel and judge the oppressors. So here we are now in the book of Exodus. God is fulfilling God's promise to Abraham, and God is using Moses as a human instrument in order to get the job done. Everything that God asks us to do is always connected to God's larger vision, God's larger purpose that oftentimes we are unable to see. So as we look at this text for a few minutes, I want to take a look at 4 distinctions that describe the man of God that God sends to lead. I want to talk about his worship, his purpose, his occupation, and his message. His worship, his purpose, his occupation, and his message. The man of God that God sends to lead is always captivated by the power and presence of God. The gazing at the burning bush in the text represents Moses' fascination with the supernatural, the realm in which God operates. It represents Moses' fascination with God's power over power. Yeah. And sometimes God uses unorthodox means to arrest the attention of God's servants. Notice that Moses does not ignore the burning bush, but something deep down in Moses' being compels him to draw closer to the flame. And the moment that Moses draws closer to the flame, God speaks to him. So worship for the man of God is much more than just saying, Lord, I love you. Lord, I thank you. Lord, I bless you. Worship for us as believers is much more than saying you are a good father, or singing songs of worship and praise. Lord, I bless your name. It is much more than just the waving of hands. It is much more than just breaking out in a shout. It is much more than just coming to a physical church building out of duty. It is much more than just planning annual days and trying to meet the budget. But worship for the man of God and worship for the people of God means positioning ourselves so that God can speak to us. And if God does not speak to us, if God does not speak to the man of God, then the man of God can't speak to the people. Oh, how we need to hear a word from the Lord today. In the midst of so much violence, in the midst of so much racism, in the midst of so much political polarization, where people's lives are being caught in the fractures of personal opinions and personal ideologies that really do nothing but destroy communities. Notice that God does not speak until Moses gets closer to the flame. And so many of us are unable to hear God's voice because we are looking at the flame, but we aren't close enough to the flame. The flame is close to us, but we are not close to the flame. Worship for the servant is the bridge which allows him or her to escape from the natural into the supernatural realm where God is, so that once one taps into God's power, it enables one to then deal with issues that we face day to day. Notice again that God does not speak to Moses until Moses draws closer to the flame. God has designed humankind that our souls are completely restless, in the words of Augustine, until we find comfort in God. So Moses says, let me get close enough to the flame to see what this flame is all about. And once Moses realizes that he is in the presence of divinity, he hides his face. He can't remain in the same state because he has just had a divine encounter with God. His fascination with the mystery of God propelled him to undertake a horrendous assignment. There's a certain romance that a man of God or a woman of God has with God. And Moses could not lead God's people until God shocked him with his power. And the pastor only sees God's ideal because of his romance with God. Everything else seems mediocre if it does not fit with God's ideal. In essence, the pastor works out of his fascination with God and out of and through and in God's power. So the man of God leads out of his worship so that he can lead out of his purpose. The man of God that God sends to lead leads people out of something but into something else. Notice that after Moses worships God, God reveals his purpose to him. And that is, God wants Israel to come out of a situation that is stifling the image that God has created them in and move them into something much better, an abundant life. In other words, in the text, a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Now, I know some of us read this and we wonder, was this land really flowing with milk and honey? It'd be kind of walking in the land of Canaan and all this milk and honey. It's not like that. It is a metaphor that explains a land that is rich in resources, abundance. It's a metaphor. So after Moses worships God, God reveals to him that God wants Israel to come out of their oppressive situation into a more abundant kind of life. But he wants Moses to do the leading. Yeah. Moses is not the one doing the delivering. It is God who is going to deliver them. Watch it. But Moses will be the means through which God will do the deliverance. And notice in the passage, verse 8, that God specifically says, I have come down to deliver them. I have come down to deliver them. This suggests that the work is really not Moses' work. It is God's work. In other words, God is going to do the work, but he's going to use a human agent, a fugitive of law, a murderer such as Moses, as long as Moses makes himself available to God. Yeah, when we do pastoral searches, we got to do a background check, make sure they're not a criminal, and make sure they, want to do a credit check, and do all this kind of stuff. God says, I operate under a different agenda. He says, in fact, I want the worst of the worst because I have a way of redeeming people. Because after all, they're made in his image. God says, I have a way of taking people off the street, the scum of the earth, and making them into somebody, giving them purpose and intention and a sense of somebodyness in order to make the community better. In other words, God is going to work through Moses as long as Moses makes himself available to God. So God tells Moses where the people are and where he wants them to be, but he also tells Moses how to get the job done. He says, go down there and tell Pharaoh that I have an ought against him. that I don't like the way he treats my people, and I've come today to do something about it. It's a terrible thing for God to have an ought against you. Yeah, it's a terrible thing to be the object of God's wrath. And so the pastor is called to lead the people to a divine destination. And this divine destination is a place where God desires his people to be. God has already provided the instructions, and the function of the man of God is to interpret the road map for the people so that the people can avoid unnecessary roadblocks. God's desires for his people to be led out of Israel so that they may worship him. So the idea here is that as long as they are in oppressive situations, God is really not able to do God's best work, so to speak. But we know that the black church was born in oppression, and something great came out of that. But God always wants to bring his people out of oppressive situations so that God can allow them to thrive even more. Because God has something much better, much greater than that. And Moses is God's instrument to get the job done. So God's plan becomes Moses' plan. God's purpose becomes Moses' purpose, and God's vision becomes Moses' vision. So God has given every man of God a divine purpose, and this purpose is nurtured in the fascination and romance that the man of God has with his God. The work that the man of God does is connected to God's divine purpose and plan because he's really trying to lead people where they don't want to go. You know, some people really like to be stuck. They like to be in situations and conditions that keep them bound. Everybody doesn't want to be set free because they like the way it feels, and they like the way it looks, and they like the way it smells. And this is always the hard side of ministry and pastoring and working with people, because people don't always see the vision. They don't always see their own liberation. They don't always see a new way of life. They don't always see God's purposes. But the man of God always walks and works and moves with a kind of heartbeat of God that keeps him in step and in line and in sync with God's greater purpose. God calls the man of God to bring people and move people forward. So the man of God leads with his worship, his purpose, but he also leads with his occupation. The man of God is called to be a wounded healer. Notice in verse 11 in the text, the question that Moses raises. Moses says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Who am I? Why you ask me? There's nobody else out there that can do this. You've asked that same question. Hadn't there been situations where God has nudged you, or the Spirit has moved upon your heart to do something or to say something? Huh? And you ask, well, why me? You can't ask her? You can't ask him? That's what Moses is doing here. Moses raised the question. He says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" Have you seen Pharaoh, that whole Egyptian kingdom? And you want me to bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? This, y'all, is a fascinating question, because the question has two sides to it. The question is an anthropological question, but it is also a theological question at the same time. Notice, this question is about identity and not ability. Yeah, it is really a rhetorical question because Moses already knows the answer to the question. And it is an anthropological question because it deals with Moses' humanity. It deals with who Moses is in relation to Pharaoh, but wrapped up in this question is the issue of Moses' past life. He's not a clean fellow. He's got some issues with the law, still brewing from the past. He has a criminal record that really has not been expunged. And Moses knows that he can't lead God's people without dealing with the issues in his past. So God is calling Moses to be a wounded healer. His past issues in life have left scars on him, yet God is commissioning him to help bring healing to the Israelites. You know, sometimes we all have to minister out of our own pain and suffering, bringing healing to others while we ourselves are suffering and going through. That's a wounded healer. Because as we heal, as we find ourselves under the wound care of God, God allows us to minister to others. Have you ever had situations you've gone through that have left scars in your life, but yet you find yourself in situations where that same scar has allowed you to help others who are currently being scarred by the same life issue? You remember Moses' mother had to get rid of him because Pharaoh put out some legislation that targeted the black boys. But God showed Moses' mama how to get rid of him and save him at the same time. He was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and lived in the court of the king, but Moses had a bad temper. He got angry one day and killed an Egyptian and buried him in the sand, and he was quickly put on Egypt's most wanted list, so much so that he lived in the wilderness as a fugitive from the law. Many churches today wouldn't call Moses to be their leader because he has a criminal record. I'm so glad, however, that God's ways are not our ways, and they are higher and beyond our ways. Yeah. Many folk couldn't deal with Moses as a leader today. Many folks couldn't deal with Jesus as a leader today, let alone John the Baptist, who walks around with nappy hair and he eats wild locusts and he just has an unusual way of dressing. But God calls a known felon who committed first-degree murder to lead somebody out of their messiness. Now, I can't explain why God does this, but I can tell you that God has a really good cleanup service. Because when God cleans you up and puts you on the right path, you don't have to worry about anything, because God always comes to the rescue. Yes, God has a pretty good cleanup service. And when God cleans us up, he cleans the heart, he cleans our minds, and he puts purpose into our paths. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and say anything? That's the question. It's an anthropological question, but it is also a theological question because it deals with Moses' position in relationship to God's purpose. Despite all the baggage we have, God has an assignment that is tailor-made for all of us, and he gives us the power and means to get it done. So Moses' occupation is a wounded healer. His wounds from his life, from his past experience, gives him the compassion to work with God's people. Finally, the man of God leads out of his message. In other words, the man of God preaches a hardcore gospel, and that gospel is the message of liberation. Moses said this to the people of Israel: the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob has sent me to you, and this is my name forever, and I am to be remembered throughout all generations. That's verse 15. Moses was to speak truth to the powers that be, declaring this gospel of liberation, and uncompromising truth regardless of who likes it, regardless of who is implicated by it, regardless of what it costs. Family members, the status quo, our friendships in the community. The man of God upholds the standard of God in an age where alternative facts supersede issues of morality and community. God calls the man of God to preach a message of liberation, a full gospel, not a half gospel. And that full gospel is the fact that God has come to save people, not just from their spiritual issues and conditions, but that God is also concerned about the social and the economic injustices that people face. It's a response to God's grace to preserve, God's grace to save, God's grace to bless, God's grace to make new. God calls a man of God to lead out of his worship, out of his occupation, out of his message. And we celebrate today Pastor Clark because God has sent him to lead us and to help us navigate life so that we can become a community that God can put God's stamp of approval on, a community that can change the community itself, that can respond to issues, but to make people's lives better. For 14 years, God has been working through Pastor Clark. He's been working through Sardis, marrying pastor and church. For 14 years. Today we give God thanks and praise for that. God bless you, and God keep you.